Hi, so I wanted to give you a quick and dirty short demo on how to use watercolor in the same way that we are talking about using oils and acrylics. To start with a no-tan to block in wet and wet and to move from dark to light. So here you see me starting out by getting the paper evenly wet with a large brush. So I'm spreading the water out and covering the whole sheet to the point that the water is soaking into the paper, and it will be ready to use when the paper's not shiny anymore. So when you tilt it and you can see shine, it's still too damp to work on wet and wet without having it bleed everywhere and run into everything else. So make sure that you give yourself enough time to dampen the paper and work the water in so that the paper is moist but not soaking wet with puddles of water on the top. If you have puddles of water, the paint is going to bleed from one section into another and you won't have as much control. So next I'm loading my brush and mixing purple with dark green terre verte, and it makes a nice almost inky dark purple that I'm using as my no-tan. So here I'm blocking that in, and you can tell that the brush is fairly dry, so I am not re-wetting the brush tremendously as I do this. And that means that even though I've wet the paper, by doing that means I have longer to work on it, the paint is not spreading out and pooling and puddling. And you can also tell that I am really loading that brush with a lot of pigment. As I add the pigment, if I add a little bit of water to the brush, then I am taking the brush to the paper towel first and wiping or blotting off some of the water at the base of the brush. And you can see here I'm wiping the brush and pulling the water out before I go and reload the brush. So it's super important to keep that level of moisture under control. One of the things you can do with good paint, and this is Daniel Smith's watercolor, is that even with a dye color like this, I can go back in and I can pull out that saturated color. So you can see where I've left a large light area for the painting, but I'm going back in and pulling out areas that are going to be smaller trees in the painting. And I'm sorry this is so shaky. My battery died on the camera, the good camera, so I am literally holding my cell phone as I paint. Over there you can see I'm blotting off the paint and working in a sort of light green gold color that is the color of that late winter, early spring greenery that's on the edge of the swamp. So again, working from dark to light. I'm leaving the lightest spaces. You have to have an idea of where those are going to be before you get started in order to leave those empty. And then you can also still, as I said earlier, pull out, sorry, dropped the mic, pull out those thin areas that you want to make lighter. So as I'm working in the blue, that's an ultramarine, French ultramarine blue, I'm also pulling up some of the purple so that I can get more of a pooled water effect there, because that's the reflection of the edge of the pond to the edge of the swamp in the water. It was a real period of high water, very still water, so it's almost like a mirror or like glass. And again, as in my oil paintings, I'm not trying to capture every detail, but I'm trying to capture the light, the values, the intensity of the colors, the temperature of the colors, the basic feeling of the scene rather than the literal details. I think this is really important, especially if you're working plein air in any medium, because if you're trying to capture all the literal details, you're going to not have enough time to finish the painting. The scene will change, the light will change, you'll be attacked by mosquitoes. You really do not have a tremendous amount of time. So working from observation is like working from the model. Working from observation outside is like working from the model. You're trying to capture the essence of the pose, the essence of the scene, as quickly and effectively as possible, not the literal details. So stopping to draw little itty-bitty branches at this point would be very similar to focusing on the hand and leaving the rest of the body alone if I were working from the model. So when you're working from observation outside, you're trying to capture the feel, the light, the overall value relationships as quickly as possible. And as you can see here, I'm using a paper towel as much almost as I'm using the brush. So if I want to pull some areas out to then go back and add color into, I'll dampen the paper and then use the paper towel to pull that color, that pigment back up again. And if I were taking a little bit more time, I think I'd be a lot more precise about how I was doing that, because I am working ultra fast here. But here you can see me working back into those lighter areas with the ultramarine blue that was the reflection of the sky. It's beginning to pool and puddle some of that color so that it imitates the effects of reflected light and color on the water. So now I've got the water blocked in, the basic value and color of the foliage that's behind those standing trees. I've left a large white space for the largest tree and pulled out two smaller trees that are a real dominant part of the composition to me. They kind of anchor the composition. Next, I'm going to start breaking those larger shapes down into some smaller shapes. So I have a red oxide, very much like a burnt sienna, which is a complement for the blue and a near complement for the purple that I'm using. So I'm going to use it not only to add lighter values of the reddish brown to that foliage on the edge of the swamp, but also to neutralize some of the intensity of the purple and the blue. So it's adding to the darks of those dark blue and purple areas. And as I work, I keep going back and pulling back out some of those light areas for the trees. So that's a fairly constant work in progress, so that I'm bopping back and forth between the light and dark areas in watercolor, just like I move back and forth in the light and dark areas in oils. I call that kind of doing a dance, because you are adjusting both as you go. One of the nice things about watercolor is, even though that has dried and I painted that a couple of days ago, I could go back into it now and pull more of that dark color off in areas that I wanted to. So I've decided that that right-hand side is a little darker than I really wanted it to be. So I'm going back in and pulling some of that color out. And sorry you can't see the paper towel up there. I'm painting one-handed and it's not always that effective for my camera work. So I'm pulling that color out. I've worked water into it, and then I can take the paper towel and pull the pigment off. And then when I go back in, it's going to still be darker on that side, which is what I was after, but not as dark, not as big a contrast as it was becoming. It was becoming a little too contrasty. Just wanted to lighten it up a little bit. and working some more of that green gold in. And then pulling that color back off of that tree trunk that I wanted to leave lighter. And just like with oils, as I've discussed with the oils, you can take a wet and wet painting in watercolor to as tight a degree of representation as you want to. I'm going to stop this one while it's still fairly abstract, because I was doing it as a sketch or a study. But if I wanted to, I could keep working back into it, breaking those shapes down, those larger shapes into smaller shapes, and moving more shadow color in at the edge of the swamp where it meets the land, and adding more detail and shadows to the tree trunks. So where you stop on that blocking in process is entirely up to you. You can leave it very loose and very abstracted, or you can tighten it up and make it much more representational. You have choices. So it's not a thing where you, if you start by blocking in, it's not a thing where you have to decide at the very beginning and you're locked in. You can choose as you're working how you're going to treat the painting. And here we're almost done. Again, pulling back out the whites of the tree trunks, or the lighter values. Because in reality, the tree trunks, although they appear very light in the photograph, they're not white. They are a slightly darker value. And if you had left all of that stark white in the tree trunks in the back, it would look really odd. So having some variation in value in that, I think it helps the realism, the representation of the scene. So again, I'm blotting out some pigment in the background so that I can add more color on that left-hand side. So I'm going to add some more of the green gold to imply some more foliage that's a little bit further behind the bright green that's in the light. So here you can see me blotting off the water. So there's not a lot of water, it's mainly pigment. And then working the green into the background of the painting. You can see from the slight bit of reflection just how much water is not on the painting. So it's wet and wet, but there are not pools and puddles of water here. The paper's damp, and I allowed it to soak in a little bit, not real long. It was less than maybe a couple of minutes at the most. But it has allowed the paper to absorb the moisture without turning it into puddles and pools, and I'm not overloading the brush with water. So now I'm using some of that red oxide to go into the purple in the shadow areas to darken the purple at the bottom and the sides of the water. Since water is normally a little bit darker than what it's reflecting. And also adding some more of that in the background at the top. So here you see it. Looking, deciding if there's anything else I need to do. I'm going to pull back out some of that tree trunk. So the last little bit that I'm working on is to make the tree trunks a little bit more defined. And I'm doing that not by adding color, but by pulling color off. And not all the way down, because there are some darker values in there. And then I will go back into that trunk that's on the right-hand side that I had left white because it's the one that's closest to me. And I'm going to fix the edges of that were a little bit broken up by the application of paint earlier. Again, where it gets too wet, I can go back in and blot off the excess moisture and pull off any extra pigment that I need to. So there you have it. There is our final painting. About a 15-minute quick watercolor study. And we've worked from dark to light, just as we've shown in oils and acrylics. So you can apply the exact same methods we've talked about in the other media to watercolor as well. So I hope this has been helpful. Sorry for the quick and dirtiness of the demo, and happy painting.